Welcome back to Intro to Philosophy 1010. Our book is The World of Philosophy, an introductory reader by Stephen Kahn. And in this video, we are going over exam 4, question for part A, question 1. What are the similarities and differences between Kant and Mill on ethics? Which position is better argued, why, and explain in part B, question 4 and 5. So question 4 is explain how the categorical imperative is used as a decision procedure. And number 5, explain how the principle of utility is used as a decision procedure. And we will also be going over in module 9, this is discussion forum number 6. This video will help you answer this question. One big difference between some of the views in modules 8 and 9 is whether they are duty-based, deontological, or results-based, consequentialist. In general, do you think actions should be judged according to whether they conform to duty, or do you think they should be judged according to what effects the action produced? Explain. So, in general, do you think actions should be judged according to whether they conform to duty or what effects they produce? Now notice, do you think actions should be judged? It's not, the question isn't, do you think the actors should be judged? This is an important distinction that John Stuart Mill makes in his essay on utilitarianism. So Mill says that the moral worth, I'm going to read here, I'm going to go through bits and pieces of each of these essays, both of which are excerpts from larger essays. And I'll be going over Kant first in more detail, but I want to start with Mill on page 338. And here is it. It is a segment of a sentence on the left-hand column, right in the middle. He says, utilitarian moralists have gone beyond almost all others in affirming that the motive has nothing to do with the morality of the action, though much with the worth of the agent. So Mill is distinguishing the action from the actor. And an action has moral worth, according to Mill, if it creates happiness for the greatest number of people when you consider everyone who's involved in that moral decision. That is what makes the action moral. But the moral worth of the actor depends on the motive of the action and not on the consequences of the act. So that one segment of a sentence, I think, helps to bridge the gap between Kant, who says the opposite. He says the effects of an action have no moral worth. It doesn't make any difference whether it has happiness producing effects or unhappiness producing effects. The only thing that gives an action moral worth is the motive of the actor. And the only motive that gives an action moral worth is respect for our duty to the idea of a universal law. And this has to do with his categorical imperative. Act only in such a way that you can will that your action become a universal law. So reduce your specific action. You know, I want to borrow money from a friend of mine. I know I can't pay him back, but I need the money now because if I don't get it, you know, then I won't be able to go to see the movie I want to see with this person I want to see the movie with, so I'll borrow it. All right, make that a universal law. Whenever it's convenient for you, it's okay to borrow money with no intention of paying it back. If you made that a universal law, says Kant, then it would contradict itself, because nobody would trust anybody, and that would undermine civilization, and therefore that would not be an adequate piece of universal legislation. So therefore, don't do the action. That's the categorical imperative. We'll get into it. I'll read the actual text in a little bit. And the utilitarian motive, again, is act only in such a way that your act produces the greatest amount of happiness everyone considered. That is John Stuart Mill. But again, what I want to keep in mind here is that Mill distinguishes between the moral worth of the agent and the moral worth of the action. And Kant doesn't. He says an action only has moral worth based on the motive of the actor. And Mill says the exact opposite. So if you're looking for the big difference, that's the big difference. But at the same time, that passage from 338 shows also a similarity, that they both say that the moral worth of the agent does have to do with the motive behind the action. Okay, so I am going to very quickly go over some of the main points from these articles, and I'll let you form your own opinions here. But let me just read bits and pieces. So from Immanuel Kant, this is from Groundwork for the Metaphysics of Morals, and it's page 328 of our book. And he says, it is impossible to imagine anything at all in the world, or even beyond it, that can be called good without qualification except a good will. Intelligence, wit, judgment, all of these virtues they're good in a certain respect, but they can become evil if the will behind them is evil. So then he'll say power, wealth, honor, even health, and that total well-being and contentment with one's condition, which we call happiness, can make a person bold, but consequently often reckless as well, unless a good will is present to correct their influence on the mind, thus adjusting the whole principle of one's action to render it conformable to universal ends. So what he's saying there is even happiness can't be a good in itself. He'll later admit everyone does naturally desire happiness, but happiness can't be the ultimate end. It is a universal end, he's going to admit, but it can't be the ultimate end, because even happiness, if it's not guided by a good will, can lead to what he'll say is recklessness, and that's the consequences it has on society. So he's saying if these things have bad consequences on society, then they can't be inherently good. So too much happiness can have bad consequences on society, he's saying. And it goes without saying that the sight of a creature enjoying uninterrupted prosperity, but never feeling the slightest pull of a pure and good will, cannot excite approval in a rational and impartial spectator. Consequently, a good will seems to constitute the indispensable condition even of our worthiness to be happy. Okay, so I would say a similarity here with Mill that we'll be going over is that Mill does say we should guide our will by some kind of a universal principle, which he calls the Utilitarian Ethic. But the goal of the Utilitarian Ethic is to promote happiness in other people as much as possible. So that's, this is, and I mentioned before how this is the big difference between the two, but the fact that Mill says the moral worth of the agent is independent of the consequences of the action, but the moral worth of the action is dependent solely on its effects, not at all on the motive behind it. Okay, so a little lower on page 329, left-hand column, a good will is not good because of its effects or accomplishments, and not because of its adequacy to achieve any proposed end. It is good only by virtue of its willing, that is, it is good in itself. I think Mill would agree. A good will is good regardless of its consequences, but a good action can only be good morally if it produces a greater amount of happiness, everyone considered. So considered in itself, it is to be treasured as incomparably higher than anything it could ever bring about, merely in order to satisfy some inclination, or if you like, the sum total of all inclinations. Even if it were to happen that a will could affect none of its goals, still, he's saying, even then it would still, like a jewel, glisten in its own right as something that has its full worth in itself. So a good will is good in itself. If you have a good will and your intentions are to do a good action, then you're good, regardless of the consequences. You have to actually try, he says. It can't just be, I want to do it, but then you don't utilize all of your powers. But if you utilize all of your powers to achieve your goal that you determined by a good will, which involves the categorical imperative that we're going to go over in a second here, if you tried your hardest and you failed miserably, it doesn't take one iota of brilliance. It doesn't reduce the glistening worth of your action in any way. So says Immanuel Kant. All right, so on page 330, I'm just going to read bits and pieces here. The left-hand column, the moral worth of an action done out of duty has its moral worth, not in the objective to be reached by that action, but in the maxim in accordance with which the action is decided upon. It depends, therefore, not on actualizing the object of the action, but solely on the principle of volition in accordance with which the action was done, without any regard for objects of the faculty of desire. A little lower down, he says, it can be found nowhere but in the principle of the will, irrespective of the ends. The next paragraph, duty is the necessity of an act done out of respect for the law. While I can certainly have an inclination for an object that results from my proposed action, I can never respect it precisely because it is nothing but an effect of a will and not its activity. So here's a big difference between Kant and Mill. Kant is emphasizing respect. So Mill is going to emphasize happiness. If you produce more happiness, which is the presence of pleasure in the absence of pain, then that action is moral. Kant says you can't respect happiness because happiness is the effect of a will. Everyone wants happiness, he's going to admit, but it's not you can't respect the effects of will, you can only respect a good will itself. And respect comes from a recognition of our duty to obey a universal law. So again, he says, duty is the necessity of an act done out of respect for the law. And he's going to go on to explain this a little bit more. On the right-hand column, he says, at most I can approve of that towards which I feel an inclination, and occasionally I can like the object of somebody else's inclination myself, that is, see it as conducive to my own advantage. But the only thing that could be an object of respect, and thus a commandment for me, is something that is conjoined with my will, purely as a ground and never as a consequence, something that does not serve my inclination, but overpowers it, or at least excludes it entirely from my decision-making. Consequently, nothing but the law itself. So this is reminiscent of Plato's idea of the law itself, these absolute ideas, these eternal sources of things. Now Kant doesn't, he bridges the gap between Plato's form of rationalism and the empiricist philosophy that knowledge comes from our five sense organs. But continuing here, he says, now if an action done out of duty is supposed to exclude totally the influence of inclination, and along with inclination every object of volition, then nothing remains that could determine the will except objectively the law and subjectively pure respect for this practical law. What is left, therefore, is the maxim to obey this sort of law, even when doing so is prejudicial to all my inclinations. Okay, this is a similarity with Mill, because he's going to say the utilitarian ethic demands that you calculate the moral worth of your action with a completely disinterested point of view. You throw your own happiness into the collective pot that you're weighing here, but you don't give yourself any more or less consideration than anybody else. So Mill and Kant both say we should guide our actions by a universal law, and that's a great similarity. The difference is that Mill says the goal of the universal law should be to create happiness as much as possible for everyone who's considered in your moral decision. Whereas for Kant, the goal should be simply to cultivate a good will. That producing happiness in others, if that's your goal, then that invalidates the moral worth of your action. Okay, so I am going to continue to read a little bit here. He says, that preeminent good, which we call moral, consists therefore in nothing but the idea of the law in itself, which certainly is present only in a rational being, so far as that idea, and not an expected result, is the determining ground of the will. So then the next paragraph, he says, everything in nature works in accordance with laws. Only a rational being has the power to act in accordance with the idea of laws, that is, in accordance with principles, and thus has a will. The idea of an objective principle insofar as it constrains a will is called a commandment of reason, and the formulation of this commandment is called an imperative. Okay, so now we're getting into the categorical imperative. What he's going to say is, how do you determine the moral worth of an action? Well, take your proposed action, translate your specific line of action into a universal moral law. If you can do that without contradicting itself, if the law you pass wouldn't destroy itself, or if it wouldn't be suitable for a piece of universal legislation that everyone should follow, then you shouldn't do it. And I'll add on to that, even if you propose a law that wouldn't necessarily destroy itself, would you be willing to make it a law? So if you wouldn't be, okay, here's what I want to do. I want to have an action, I don't want to help anybody. I don't want to hurt anybody, but people beg me for money. I don't want to give it to them. They ask me to help them move. I don't want to help them. I'm not going to help anybody do anything, and I'm not going to expect anyone to help me, but I'm not going to hinder anybody. Kant will say, yeah, well, that might be survivable as a universal law. It might not destroy society, but would you really want that to be the case? Don't you need help sometimes? So therefore, it would fail the categorical imperative. So now I'm going to read now, left-hand column, 331. All imperatives command either hypothetically or categorically. Hypothetical imperatives declare a possible action to be practically necessary as a means to the attainment of something else that one wants, or that one may want. A categorical imperative would be one that represented an action as itself objectively necessary without regard to any further end. I'm skipping a little bit. He says, if the action would be good only as a means to something else, the imperative is hypothetical. If the action is thought of as good in itself, and therefore as necessary for a will, which of itself conforms to reason as its principle, then the imperative is categorical. Okay, do you want to, what do I want to do? Oh, I want to go to the store to pick up some power steering fluid for my car. Okay, so I've got a specific objective in mind here that my action is trying to achieve. So that's a hypothetical imperative. It's not, if the action would be good only as a means to something else, the imperative is hypothetical. If the action is thought of as good in itself and therefore as necessary, all right, well, so what is a categorical imperative? Hypothetical imperatives are easy to understand. What is a categorical imperative? There is, however, one end that we may presuppose as actual in all rational beings. All right, so now here's the part where he's going to create another similarity with Mill. He's going to get to the categorical imperative over on page 332, but he's kind of prepping it here, and now he's going to talk about happiness. So this is why this is important for a comparison with Mill. He says, there is, however, one end that we may presuppose as actual in all rational beings, and thus there is one aim which they not only might have, but which we can assume with certainty that they all do have by a necessity of nature, and that aim is perfect happiness. The hypothetical imperative, which affirms the practical necessity of an action as a means to the promotion of perfect happiness, is an assertoric imperative. That comes from Aristotelian logic, assertoric. It's something that must happen, not something that might happen. We must not characterize it as necessary merely for some uncertain, merely possible purpose, but as necessary for a purpose that we can presuppose a priori and with certainty to be present in everyone because it belongs to the essence of human beings. So everybody wants to be happy. Mill says the same thing, and on that they both agree. The disagreement comes in, does making happiness, producing happiness the motive of your action, make the actions moral? Kant says no, Mill says yes. But again, Mill says, yeah, that determines the morality of the action. That doesn't determine the moral worth of the actor. So that's a very important distinction, and I mentioned that. That's from page 338 on the left-hand column. Okay, so now we can call skill in the choice of the means to one's own greatest well-being, which is happiness, prudence. Okay, he puts that in quotation marks, in the narrowest sense of the word. So the imperative concerning the choice of means to one's own happiness, that is, the precept of prudence, still remains hypothetical. The action is commanded not absolutely, but only as a means to a further end. All right, so what Mill is saying is a moral action, which is an action that produces the greatest amount of happiness overall. Kant is calling that a hypothetical, or a subsection of the hypothetical imperative, which is the assertoric imperative. It's an action done to achieve some other goal. And the goal, however, is happiness. And the reason that that's a special goal is because everyone, as a consequence of the essence of human beings, we all desire happiness. But still, he's saying, even though that's a universal desire we all have, any action done to fulfill a desire is outside of the moral sphere. It's a prudent action, it's a commendable action, it just has no moral worth. So again, this definition of the morality of an action versus the morality of an actor, I think, if we understand how Mill differentiates the two, these two moral systems are a lot more compatible and a lot more similar. So another thing here is he ends by saying that, so the imperative concerning the choice of means to one's own happiness, that is the precept of prudence, still remains hypothetical. The action is commanded not absolutely, but only as a means to a further end. But Mill does make this commandment absolutely. It's not your own happiness, he says, that you should guide your moral decision-making. It's the overall happiness of everyone considered, yourself on an equal standing with everybody else. So you see how that really narrows the gap between these two philosophies. And Mill reiterates, it's not your own individual happiness, it's the disinterested, rational weighing of everyone's happiness. And if it comes out that you have to swallow an enormous amount of unhappiness in order to promote a greater amount of happiness for everybody else, then you should do it according to the utilitarian ethic. Okay, so I'm going to skip over to page 332, the left-hand column. There is therefore only one categorical imperative, and it is this: act only on the maxim by which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. All right, reduce your moral decision to a universal law. Reduce it to a maxim and see if that law would work as a piece of universal legislation. So he gives 4 examples. A man feels sick of life as the result of a mounting series of misfortunes. He's hopeless, so he wants to kill himself. Now he tests whether the maxim of his action could really become a universal law of nature. His maxim, however, is, I make it my principle out of self-love to shorten my life if its continuance threatens more evil than it promises advantage. So that's what the man's maxim is. The only further question is whether this principle of self-love can become a universal law of nature. But one sees at once that a nature whose law was that the very same feeling meant to promote life should actually destroy life would contradict itself and hence would not endure as nature. The maxim, therefore, could not possibly be a general law of nature, and thus it wholly contradicts the supreme principle of all duty. And what is the supreme principle of all duty? That you act only in such a way that your action can be reduced to a universal law that does not contradict itself. So is what he's saying here, does it make sense? So the feeling of self-love, if you're using that to destroy yourself, that contradicts the natural purpose of self-love, which is to preserve your life. Okay, so I think you could argue against that, but I'm trying to keep this moving. So the second example is another finds himself driven by need to borrow money, but he knows he can't pay it back. So I'm going to borrow the money without knowing full well that I don't intend to pay it back, although I say I'm going to pay it back. All right, so now let's apply the categorical imperative. He says, I therefore transform the unfair demand of self-love into a universal law and frame my question thus. How would things stand if my maxim became a universal law? I then see immediately that this maxim can never qualify as a self-consistent universal law of nature, but must necessarily contradict itself. Why? Because for no one would believe he was being promised anything, but would laugh at any such utterances as hollow pretense. No one would trust anyone anymore. There could be no promises because everyone would assume, oh, if it's convenient for you, you're going to just break your promise. If everyone followed the law that you make, he's saying this is how it would happen. Now, of course, when people do make promises that they don't intend to keep, they just make an exception for themselves. They still hope everyone else keeps their promises, and he's saying that's self-contradictory. If everyone acted the way you act, then would you want that to be the case? Clearly you wouldn't. Therefore, don't do it. So he's just giving a practical method by which to decide whether or not your actions are moral. So the third example, a third finds in himself a talent that with a certain amount of cultivation could make him a useful man for all sorts of purposes. But he wants to take it easy. He doesn't want to develop his talents. You know, hey, I'm just going to live my life and enjoy. So then on page 33, the left-hand column, he says, only he cannot possibly will that this should become a universal law of nature, or should be implanted in us as such a law by a natural instinct. For as a rational being, he necessarily wills that all his powers should be developed, since they are, after all, useful to him, and given to him for all sorts of possible purposes. So when he uses the word useful, I think of utilitarianism. And so he's saying that a good will doesn't take into effect the usefulness of an action. It doesn't take into effect the consequences of an action. And yet, when someone's contemplating not developing the talents which would make them useful to society, Kant is saying that is immoral because you couldn't make it a universal law that people would neglect to develop their talents, because then nobody would be very useful to anybody else. So making other people useful for others is a universal law. At any rate, as I said, each of these four examples, I think you could argue against the logic of them, but I'm not going to get into that. A fourth man who is himself flourishing, but sees others who have to struggle with great hardship, he says, okay, let them. I'm not going to give them anything. I'm not going to take anything away from them. I'm going to leave them alone. So then he says, but although it is possible that a universal law of nature in accord with this maxim could exist, it is impossible to will that such a principle should hold everywhere as a law of nature. For a will that intended this would be in conflict with itself, since many situations might arise in which the man needs love and sympathy from others, and in which, by such a law of nature generated by his own will, he would rob himself of all hope of the help he wants. Okay. So those are some of his examples, and then he brings up the second part of his moral paradigm, and this is that you should always treat people not only as a means towards some end of your own, but also always as an end unto themselves. Don't use people. We all have to use each other. You call up the pizza place and you order a pizza. You're using the people to help you, but you should also think of those people as ends unto themselves. They have their own moral worth, irregardless of whatever purpose that they can serve. So the right-hand column, page 333. Suppose, however, there were something whose existence in itself had an absolute worth, something that, as an end in itself, could be a ground of definite laws. Then in it, and in it alone, would the ground of a possible categorical imperative, that is, of a practical law, reside. Now I say a human being, and in general every rational being, does exist as an end in himself, not merely as a means to be used by this or that will as it pleases. In all his actions, whether they are directed to himself or to other rational beings, A human being must always be viewed at the same time as an end. So rational beings, on the other hand, are called persons because their nature already marks them out as ends in themselves. So then he applies that. Not only should you act in such a way that your action can become a universal law, but the universal law that you make must treat people as ends in themselves and not merely as the means for somebody else's purposes. So he says, let us keep to our previous example. First, that the man who contemplates suicide will ask himself whether his action could be compatible with the idea of humanity as an end in itself. If he damages himself in order to escape from a painful situation, he is making use of a person, namely himself, merely as a means to maintain a tolerable state of affairs till the end of his life. Secondly, the man who has in mind making a false promise to others will see at once that he is intending to make use of another person merely as a means to an end with that which that person does not share. Oh, can I borrow some money? I'll pay you back tomorrow. I know I'm never going to pay this guy back. So you're using that person as a means to your own end, not respecting the desires of that person. So therefore, that does not pass the test of a categorical imperative, which must treat other rational human beings as ends unto themselves, as well as means. It's inescapable. We're all means to each other's ends, but we are also all an end unto ourselves. So thirdly, it is not enough that an action not conflict with humanity in our own person as an end in itself. It must also harmonize with this end. Now, there are in humanity capacities for greater perfection that form part of nature's purpose for humanity in our own purpose. To neglect these can perhaps be compatible with the survival of humanity as an end in itself, but not with the promotion of that end. All right, so the third person said, I have these talents, but I don't want to develop them. I'm going to live a life of pleasure. Okay, well then, you're not developing the talents that could help you promote I'm going to read this again. Now, there are in humanity capacities for greater perfection that form part of nature's purpose for humanity in our own person. To neglect these can perhaps be compatible with the survival of humanity as an end in itself, but not with the promotion of that end. All right, so here's it. I treat you, I respect the fact that you have your own desires, and I'm going to let you freely develop them, but I'm not going to contribute to developing them. So he's saying, all right, you haven't violated their existence as an end unto themselves, but you should actively promote it as well. So fourthly, the natural end that all humans beings seek is their own perfect happiness. That's what Mill also says. Now, the human race might indeed exist if everybody contributed nothing to the happiness of others, but at the same time refrained from deliberately impairing it. This harmonizing with humanity as an end in itself would, however, be merely negative and not positive, unless everyone also endeavors, as far as he can, to further the ends of others. For the ends of any person who is an end in himself must, if this idea is to have its full effect in me, be also, as far as possible, my ends. All right, so then that's bringing Mill and Kant a lot closer. And that's the last paragraph of our Kant reading. The next reading is John Stuart Mill. It's probably intentional because he's saying the natural end that all human beings seek is their own perfect happiness. Mill absolutely agrees there. And Kant is furthermore saying that you should actively promote the happiness of others by harmonizing your will with their wills, because you should respect that they are ends unto themselves as a rational being, and so are we. So that brings Kant a lot closer to Mill. And there's a lot of avenues we could go down here that I'm thinking through, but I'm looking at the clock, and I'm in an introductory class. Let's just get the main ideas out, and you can draw connections as you see fit. So, John Stuart Mill. What is utilitarianism? It holds that actions, this is page 335, actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, Wrong, as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. By happiness is intended pleasure and the absence of pain. By unhappiness, pain and the privation of pleasure. Page 336, left-hand column, about halfway down. Here's another rule of utilitarianism, and this distinguishes him from his earlier mentor and utilitarian co-founder, Jeremy Bentham. Mill says, unlike Bentham, of two pleasures, if there be one to which all or almost all who have experience of both give a decided preference, irrespective of any feeling of moral obligation to prefer it, that is the more desirable pleasure. All right, so you've got two types of pleasures. How can you determine which is superior? If you're a utilitarian, you're trying to make your moral decisions based on promoting the overall happiness of everyone considered. And happiness is the presence of pleasure and the absence of pain. Okay, well, there's a bunch of different types of pleasure. So you need to know how to weigh their relative worth. How can we tell? And he's saying you simply address the people who have experience of both types. And he'll go on to say, let me just, on the right-hand column in the middle, page 336, it is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. And if the fool or the pig are of a different opinion, it is because they only know their own side of the question. The other party to the comparison knows both. So Socrates knew the pleasures of the flesh. He knew the pleasures of sex. He knew the pleasures of drinking wine. He knew the pleasures of, whatever animal pleasures humans can have, but he also knew the higher pleasures of philosophy, of developing the intellect. And Mill said, none of us would willingly become a beast in order to acquire the pleasures of an animal and give up our own intellectual abilities, even if it would be a more pleasant life. That we don't want to debase ourselves. So that there are two types of pleasures, basically, higher and lower. And him using Socrates as the example indicates that the higher pleasures are the pleasures of the intellect, developing your intellect, developing virtues. The lower pleasures are just bodily sense gratification. They're both pleasure. They both need to be calculated in the utilitarian decision-making process. But of those pleasures, the intellectual pleasures should be counted as higher. The right-hand column, 336 at the very bottom. I have dwelt on this point as being a necessary part of a perfectly just conception of utility or happiness considered as the directive rule of human conduct, but it is by no means an indispensable condition to the acceptance of the utilitarian standard, for that standard is not the agent's own greatest happiness, but the greatest amount of happiness altogether. And it may possibly be doubted whether a noble character is always the happier for its nobleness. There can be no doubt that it makes other people happier, and that the world in general is immensely a gainer by it. All right, so utilitarianism therefore could only attain its end by the general cultivation of nobleness of character, even if each individual were only benefited by the nobleness of others, and his own, so far as happiness is concerned, were a sheer deduction from the benefit. So this is where Mill starts to become more aligned with Kant, because Kant's whole point is that we need to cultivate a good will. And John Stuart Mill says you need to cultivate this utilitarian ethic, which tells people that they need to take a disinterested perspective of the whole situation and act according to this universal rule. For Kant, the categorical imperative is act. Let me just, there's two parts of it. Act only on the maxim by which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. And also act in such a way that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in any other person, always at the same time as an end, never merely as a means. Those are his universal laws by which you should act. Utilitarianism also has this universal law. Whenever you have to make a moral decision, always calculate the happiness of everyone involved, including your own, but don't give any greater or lesser weight to your own happiness. And if it turns out that you acting in such a way that causes unhappiness for yourself, but a greater amount of happiness for everyone else, then you should do it. So let me just read. And here's another point, actually. All right. According to the greatest happiness principle, this is 337 on the left-hand column, as above explained, the ultimate end, with reference to and for the sake of which all other things are desirable, is an existence exempt as far as possible from pain and as rich as possible in enjoyments, both in point of quantity and quality, the test of quality and the rule for measuring it against quantity being the preference felt by those who in their opportunities of experience have had both experiences, such as Socrates. And he says, now, the rules and precepts for human conduct, by the observance of which an existence such as has been described might be to the greatest extent possible secured to all mankind, and not only to them, but so far as the nature of things admits, to the whole sentient creation. Now, there's a big difference between Mill and Kant. Mill says only treat other rational beings. He defines a person as a rational being. They're the only ones that you need to take into account in your moral decision-making processes. If a creature has no reason, then you cannot commit an immoral act against that creature. You can treat animals as means and not at all as ends because they don't have reason. You know, what are you raising that pig for? To slaughter it, to eat it. But don't you take into account that pig's feelings? Not at all, because the pig has no reason. John Stuart Mill, on the other hand, says you should take into account the whole sentient creation. Pigs have sentience, dogs have sentience, crickets have sentience. It's been shown that plants have sentience to a degree. Quantum mechanics implies even electrons have sentience. They somehow are aware that they're being observed or not. So John Stuart Mill's utilitarianism expands your potential decision-making sphere to the entire universe. But so does Kant in this respect that he says you have to make universal laws, laws that would apply to every rational being everywhere in the universe. But his laws wouldn't apply to irrational creatures. Let me just continue here with Mill. 337, left-hand column. I must again repeat what the assailants of utilitarianism seldom have the justice to acknowledge, that the happiness which forms the utilitarian standard of what is right in conduct is not the agent's own happiness, but that of all concerned. As between his own happiness and that of others, utilitarianism requires him to be as strictly impartial as a disinterested and benevolent spectator. In the golden rule of Jesus of Nazareth, we read the complete spirit of the ethics of utility: to do as you would be done by and to love neighbor as yourself constitute the ideal perfection of utilitarian morality. Now, I will say this: love your neighbor as yourself. That is the second of two commandments that Jesus of Nazareth mentions in the Bible. First is love God. Love God with all your heart, soul, and strength. And the second is like the first, love your neighbor as yourself. The psychologist Sigmund Freud pointed out how impossible this commandment is. How can I love my neighbor as myself? I have an instinct of self-love. So I can never have the same amount of love for my neighbor as I have for myself. So you're setting me up to perceive myself as a moral failure, which is going to lead to some intense neurosis, says Freud's criticism of Christianity. But Freud was an atheist. If you do believe in God, the supreme self, then you believe that every other subordinate self is a part of the supreme self. So if you love God first, then that instinct of self-love will be automatically channeled towards every other part and parcel of the supreme self. So the idea of love your neighbor as yourself only makes pragmatic sense if you have that first part of the commandment there: love God with all your heart. And if there is no God, then even if there is no God, but you believe there's a God, then your instinct of self-love might still be able to be tricked into being projected onto others. I've analyzed that philosophical possibility before. But at any rate, let me just continue here with John Stuart Mill. As the means of making the nearest approach to this ideal, utility would enjoin first that the laws and social arrangements should place the happiness, or, as speaking practically, it may be called the interest of every individual as nearly as possible in harmony with the interest of the whole. We saw Kant talk about that too. He used the very same word harmony on page 334 in the right-hand column. You should harmonize your will with everybody else's, because we're all rational creatures, so we all obey the same universal laws, because rational laws apply to everyone equally. If we're all rational beings, then we all will have the same rationally discoverable categorical imperatives. So a law that's good for me to follow is a law that's good for everyone to follow, and I need to harmonize myself. And he furthermore said that the universal goal of all humans is perfect happiness, and that you should harmonize your this harmonizing with humanity as an end in itself would, however, be merely negative and not positive, unless everyone also endeavors as far as he can to further the ends of others. For the ends of any person who is an end in himself must, if this idea is to have its full effect in me, be also, as far as possible, my ends. So make the other people's ends your ends. If another person has a desire, that should become your desire as well, as much as possible. And everyone desires happiness. So that final paragraph on page 334 brings Mill and Kant a lot closer together, as does Mill's distinction between a moral action and a moral actor on page 338, as I've mentioned before. And I'm going to read this one again. So the utilitarian moralists have gone beyond almost all others in affirming that the motive has nothing to do with the morality of the action, though much with the worth of the agent. Kant says the moral worth of an action is entirely determined by the motive. So he completely disagrees with Mill on that point. But Mill will agree with Kant that the motive has much to do with the worth of the agent. The worth of the agent, for Kant, the ultimate worth of an actor, of a moral agent, would be to have a good will, which is a will that acts out of a sense of duty, out of a sense of respect for the idea of a universal law. As a rational being, it's our, and we didn't have it in the selection that we have in this book, but Kant goes on to say that the nature of the will is to legislate universal laws, and that we all belong to a potentially a kingdom of ends. Let me just read a little bit of that. Another old book is falling apart here. I'll have to put that back together. I think it is important enough to read The Kingdom of Ends. He's saying, I'm just going to read a little bit here. Actually, let me just read. So, with Kant, and I'm wary to mention it because it's not in our book, but Kant says that acting according to the categorical imperative makes you free, because you'll realize that you're obeying only your own law. He's saying, looking back now on all previous attempts to discover the principle of morality, we need not wonder why they all failed. I think that's pretty presumptuous of him to say, but anyway, he says, it was seen that man was bound to laws by duty, but it was not observed that the laws to which he is subject are only those of his own giving. At the same time, they are universal. So we all have reason, and that's a universal character that will determine the same moral laws for everybody. So if you use the categorical imperative and you come up with a moral law, then when you're obeying a system of morals, you're really only obeying yourself. So you have freedom. You're not enslaving yourself to some exterior principle. You're merely manifesting your own nature as a universal lawgiver, which you have in common with all rational beings. Okay, I just touched on that. I don't want to get too distracted and pulled away from completing this John Stuart Mill reading. All right, so all right, so I'm going to continue here. And this is another thing that's very similar with Kant and Mill. This is on page 338. So he says, all right, so, but to speak only of actions done from the motive of duty and in direct obedience to principle, it is a misapprehension of the utilitarian motive thought to conceive it as implying that people should fix their minds upon so wide a generality as the world or society at large. All right, so here's where he says, you don't have to expand your moral decision-making process to include all of the universe and all sentient beings every time you act. Most of the time, it'll be just among a few people. And so, okay, there's three of us. What are we going to do? Well, what's going to make all three of us, if we combine our happiness together, what's going to promote that, as opposed to just my action? He says, but the multiplication of happiness is, according to the Utilitarian Ethics, the object of virtue. The occasions on which any person except 1 in 1,000 has it in his power to do this on an extended scale, in other words, to be a public benefactor, are but exceptional. And on these occasions alone is he called on to consider public utility. In every other case, private utility, the interest of happiness of some few persons, is all he has to attend to. Now, Kant would say in every single action, no matter if it's between you and a few people or you and an entire nation, you should always expand your individual particular decision into a universal law. Mill is saying you don't have to do that, except in those 1 in 1,000 cases where you're actually a public benefactor. So, and then here comes another similarity with Kant. He says, it would be unworthy of an intelligent agent not to be consciously aware that the action is of a class which, so abstaining from vicious deeds, he's saying, yeah, utilitarian would say that. Suppose I want to do a vicious deed and that makes me happy and it makes other people happy, at least in our small group. Wouldn't that be therefore acceptable? And now he seems to be a lot more similar to the categorical imperative, because he says it would be unworthy of an intelligent agent not to be consciously aware that the action is of the class which, if practiced generally, would be generally injurious, and that this is the ground of the obligation to abstain from it. The amount of regard for the public interest implied in this recognition is no greater than is demanded of every system of morals, for they all enjoin to abstain from whatever is manifestly pernicious to society. So he's admitting it's the same in every system of morals. I don't know if that is the same in every system of morals, but it is similar to the categorical imperative. Should I do this action? No, because if this were to become a general principle, it would injure society in general. That is the categorical imperative. So again, this is right-hand column 338. Utility is often summarily stigmatized as an immoral doctrine by giving it the name of expediency and taking advantage of the popular use of that term to contrast it with principle. Oh, just do whatever's expedient. For example, tell a lie when it's necessary. But now again, this is almost the same as Immanuel Kant. But inasmuch as the cultivation in ourselves of a sensitive feeling on the subject of veracity, truth-telling, is one of the most useful, and the enfeeblement of that feeling one of the most hurtful things to which our conduct can be instrumental, and inasmuch as any, even unintentional, deviation from truth does that much toward weakening the trustworthiness of human assertion, which is not only the principal support of all present social well-being, but the insufficiency of which does more than any one thing that can be named to keep back civilization, virtue, everything on which human happiness on the largest scale depends, we feel that the violation for a present advantage of a rule of such transcendent expediency is not expedient, and that he who, for the sake of convenience to himself or to some other individual, does what depends on him to deprive mankind of the good and inflict upon them the evil involved in the greater or less reliance which they can place in each other's word, acts the part of one of their worst enemies. All right, so that is what Kant said. Why shouldn't I lie? Why shouldn't I borrow money on the pretext that I am going to pay it back when I know I won't? Kant said, because then if you made that a universal law through the categorical imperative, nobody would trust anybody ever. It's the same thing that Mill just said. Here's the difference. Mill will go on to say on page 339, the left-hand column, yet that even this rule, sacred as it is, admits of possible exceptions, is acknowledged by all moralists. Not true. Kant does not acknowledge it, the chief of which is when the withholding of some fact, as of information from a malefactor or of bad news from a person dangerously ill, would save an individual, especially an individual other than oneself, from great and unmerited evil, and when the withholding can only be effected by denial. So Kant's example was, what if a woman comes screaming around the corner, bloody, begging you to hide her, and then you hide her, and then a maniac with a knife shows up and he says, did you see a woman come running through here? Kant would say, you have to say yes, she's down there, because the categorical imperative of telling the truth is so important that even though in this one instance it would seem evil to tell the truth, the general universal benefit of strengthening the trustworthiness of your word and the idea of veracity, truth-telling in general, outweighs that pain that innocent woman will endure. And that's, I think, a weakness in Kant's argument, and John Stuart Mill says that there are exceptions. Yes, you definitely should not lie on some small pretext, but in certain special extreme situations, then it is okay. Okay, so, and I'm gonna leave it at that for these comparisons. So let me just read back through these questions. So this video on Kant and Mill goes over exam 4, part A, question 1. What are the similarities and differences between Kant and Mill on ethics? Which position is better argued, why, and explain? So I've gone over some similarities and some differences. This is an introductory class, so if you name a couple main similarities and a couple main differences, that would be plenty, and just make sure to support your answer with a quote from the book. In part B, explain how the categorical imperative is used as a decision procedure. Take your decision, your action, your proposed action, distill it down into a maxim, a universal law. Would that universal law be able to exist as a law of nature, that if everyone applied it, it wouldn't contradict itself? And would you be willing to have it so inculcated in as an instinct in nature, for example? And the other part of his categorical imperative is treat others always as not only a means but also an end unto themselves. And then part B, question 5, explain how the principle of utility is used as a decision procedure. So you should act in such a way that you promote the overall happiness, understood as the presence of pleasure and the absence of pain, that you should promote the greater happiness of everyone considered in your decision-making process. 1 in 1,000 people is a legislator, some kind of a government official or some kind of a benefactor, and they have to consider larger numbers of people, but he says most people can use the utilitarian, the principle of utility, just among their small circle of friends. And then also, again, this is covering discussion forum 6. One big difference between some of the views in modules 8 and 9 is whether they are duty-based or results-based. In general, do you think actions should be judged according to whether they conform to duty, as Kant says, or do you think they should be judged according to what effects the action produced, as Mill says? And again, if we saw on page 338, this is an important way to bridge the gap between Kant and Mill. He says, utilitarian moralists have gone beyond almost all others in affirming that the motive has nothing to do with the morality of the action, though much with the worth of the agent. So they absolutely are different when it comes to defining the morality of an action. For Mill, the action's only moral if it produces a greater amount of happiness when you've considered everyone involved. For Kant, an action is only moral if it's done with a goodwill, understood as respect for our duty to obey a universal law, on the understanding that a universal law derived from a rational mind is really our own law. Since we participate in reason, we are our own legislators, and therefore that's freedom. Freedom is obeying only your own law. that's a point that we didn't get into in our segment from the book, but Kant and Mill would both agree about the motive has a lot to do with the worth of the agent. Kant says it's all that has to do with the worth of the moral worth of a person, a good will. The motive behind your actions determines whether or not you have a good will. The effect of your action has absolutely nothing to do with the worth of a will. And Mill, I think, would tend to agree there. And Mill furthermore says that, they both say that we have to develop a goodwill in the sense that you should only act from this universal principle. They both have these universal principles that we should obey, and they both say that, don't act in a way that will tend to undermine civilization, as I've gone over before, but now I'm starting to go over everything again, so I'm going to leave it at that, and we will call this a video.